Minister for Domestic Violence.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Domestic, family and sexual violence is insidious and impacts thousands of Territorians directly and indirectly. Each and every day, perpetrators of terrorise their victims, who most often are known to them. Our community and the country as a whole were appalled when in 2023, Northern Territory Coroner Elizabeth Armitage reported that at least 3 women lost their lives to domestic violence in the NT each year. Since June this year, 7 women have lost their lives to domestic violence. 9, sorry. Families have lost a child, a sibling, a cousin. Children have lost their mum. Domestic, family and sexual violence is the main driver of homelessness in the Northern Territory. It's often the trigger that results in a child being placed in care. It tears families apart. The tentacles of the scourge that is domestic, family and sexual violence creeps across all aspects of our community. Madam Speaker, there's no question that domestic, family and sexual violence is having a significant impact on our community. There's equally no question that the processes implemented by the previous Labor government to address the issues of domestic, family and sexual violence are not working. Why do I say this? I say this because over the 8 years when those on the other side had an opportunity to make real change and take real action to protect the victims of domestic, family and sexual violence, to make our communities safer by addressing the horrendous impact of domestic, family and sexual violence on our community, the incidence of domestic violence assaults across the Territory increased by 82%. For some regions, the incidence of domestic, family and sexual violence doubled. Tennant Creek, 101%. In others, more than doubled. Katherine, 135%. Palmerston, 180%. Most violent crime in the Northern Territory is domestic violence related, and more than a third of the offenders before the court have had a domestic violence related offence. The financial cost of domestic, family and sexual violence to our community is more than $606 million per year. The system that is in place and has been in place for quite some time now is clearly broken, and a new approach is urgently needed. So it's incredibly reassuring to hear that those on the other side are prepared to take a bipartisan approach to this issue, because that is what our community will expect as steps are taken to address this crisis. I look forward to those on the other side supporting an approach focused on measurable, deliverable outcomes, at supporting programs designed to deliver a reduction of domestic violence assaults, not the damning increase that we've seen in recent years of the incidence of domestic violence. Programs that are not couched in vague motherhood statements but have clear, actionable deliverables. To that end, an audit of the Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence Reduction Framework 2018-2028 will be undertaken to ensure programs are achieving measurable outcomes. We will consult with communities and service providers on the ground to understand what they need. We'll listen to frontline workers on what works and what doesn't. We will fight for the Territory to receive the necessary funding to deliver these programs based on need, as the need is great. Madam Speaker, the only acceptable measure of the success of these programs will be a reduction in domestic violence-related assaults. There is a great deal to be done. If we are to stem the tide of domestic, family and sexual violence in our community, it cannot be more of the same. That approach needs to be different. This is what our government will do. So again, I am reassured to hear the Leader of the Opposition observe that to make any inroads in reducing the incidence of domestic, family and sexual violence, a bipartisan approach is needed, because that tells me that those on the other side know that change and innovation and development of what is required on the ground when we hear from those on the ground is what is needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the raising of this matter of public importance by the Leader of the Opposition. Domestic, family and sexual violence are matters of deep public importance across all electorates, including my own electorate of Fong Lim. I want to thank the Minister for Prevention of Domestic Violence for her contribution to this debate on behalf of the government, and for clearly explaining the scope of the issues. There is a cost in every way to society, of course, but the victims in the first instance when we are talking about these issues. And as has been raised by other members, the costs are innumerate, social and economic. Our government is clearly committed to reduction and prevention. And I thank the Minister again for articulating clearly in her statement that we acknowledge the scope of this problem, don't in any way seek to diminish it, and are committed to the prevention of domestic violence. This is a serendipitous and timely matter of public importance, given our discussions today on alcohol policy, and in fact the suite of legislation that we are considering in this parliamentary sitting, both last week and this week. The proposer for this matter of public importance seeks a strong bipartisan approach to addressing these issues, a commitment reaffirmed by our Minister and echoed by, I think, every voice in this chamber in respect of the contributions that have been made on this debate. It's in that spirit that I am also participating in this debate to share with all of you as colleagues just a small portion of what I've learned in preparing for some of the bills on debate under recent and current consideration. You've all recurrently heard me raise the need to be mindful of expert evidence with specificity and not just in motherhood statements or in sweeping generalisations. I'd like to draw attention to a couple of pieces of work that I think are salient in the debate and informative for everybody going forward. One is from the International Journal of Drug Policy, another is from Drug and Alcohol Review. What's notable about these pieces of research is that they are both academic journal papers published this year. They are geographically specific to considering issues in the 25 electorates that we represent. Their contributing authors are people invested in the Northern Territory and allied and associated to bodies like the Menzies School of Health Research. And they are rigorous pieces of work that should inform why there is a connection between what it is that we are seeking to do this week and the aspiration to reduce and prevent, indeed, domestic, family and sexual violence. I'm not going to cherry pick data selectively from these works. There's been a lot of that's happened in lots of forms in this chamber in recent years. I'm pleased to say less so in the first few days that I have been in this chamber. I don't want to distort the totality of the work, and I would certainly encourage people to make their own inquiries. But I do want to speak to the broad parameters of these studies and their conclusions instead, because they inform what everybody is calling for here, which is evidence-based strategy. Clifford, Wright, Miller, Coomer, Griffiths, Smith and Livingston have produced a paper on the impacts of alcohol supply reduction measures on police-recorded adult domestic and family violence in the Northern Territory of Australia. Their work has essentially looked at the banned drinkers register, the minimum unit price, police auxiliary liquor inspectors, daily purchase opening hours, examining data from January 2014 until February 2020. And I will quote specifically so as not to distort their findings or put my own spin on it in any way. Their summary conclusion is as follows, and I will use the acronyms. Quote, PALIs and DPOH were associated with some reductions in domestic and family violence. The BDR was associated with some increases. The upward trend commences prior to the BDR, so it is also plausible that the BDR had no effect on domestic and family violence outcomes. Though minimum unit price, MUP, was associated with reductions in the NT-wide model, there were no changes in sites without concurring PALIs. This is rigorous, independent academic research, and it's the kind of work we should be paying mind to. The conclusion of this body of work is that this study provided evidence that 2 of the 4 alcohol policies assessed were associated with some reductions in domestic and family violence, PALIs and DPOH. It appears that minimum unit pricing did not affect domestic family violence outcomes. The BDR was associated with some increases, which could represent an actual increase or an artificial increase. Given that the upward trend appears to commence prior to the BDR and continue after BDR, it is also possible that the BDR simply had no effect on population-level DFV outcomes. Future research should consider the impact of the BDR as an individual ban on individual outcomes rather than at a population level. Exploration of the impact of these policies on other alcohol-related harms would provide a more robust picture of the extent of the policy's impact. As I said, you can draw your own conclusions, but the most contemporaneous research produced by the people that are examining our polity is suggesting that there is a strong correlation between alcohol and the matters of public importance that we are addressing today. And that is why it is worth raising them, not in the interest of politicising the debate, but about providing context to the debate so that we are doing more than issuing statements of lament and sadness and motherhood statements. I turn now to police-recorded adult sexual assault in the Northern Territory involving alcohol and alcohol policy effects. Again, a study done by Clifford et al., examining data from 2014 to 2020, which concludes the rate of adult sexual assaults in the NT is extremely high and many involve alcohol. Neither the banned drinker register or minimum unit price were associated with changes in police-recorded adult sexual assaults in Greater Darwin or across the NT. We've heard a range of statistics, and the statistics that are put out here, again, are robust. That from January 2014 to December 2020, most police-recorded sexual assault victims were female, some 92% of them. Half, 50%, were non-Indigenous. 41% were Indigenous, and 9% were recorded as unknown. A large proportion of those victims were assaulted by strangers, 38%, followed by acquaintances, 27%. Almost 1 in 4 adult sexual assaults, 23%, included a domestic and family violence flag. Again, drawing it back to where we are today, quote unquote, alcohol was involved in 40% of adult sexual assaults, including use by offenders, victims, or both. You cannot ignore the nexus between what it is we are trying to achieve here and this matter of public importance. This particular secondary piece of research also aimed to assess whether the introduction of 2 recent alcohol policies was associated with changes in police-recorded sexual assaults, and concluded again that neither BDR nor MUP were associated with changes in police-recorded adult sexual assault in across the NT or in Greater Darwin. They acknowledge the same limitations that have been acknowledged by others in relation to sexual assault being chronically underreported, not least in the context of the additional challenges of remote and rural areas, alcohol being involved, and so forth. But again, note that the underreporting of sexual assault is a significant limitation, while the underreporting of sexual assault is a significant limitation, provided a willingness to report has remained stable, the trends in this data will broadly represent the underlying trends in the incidence of sexual assault. The sum total of this, again, is to carry weight in the debate that we are having more broadly. Despite the low counts, the rate of 105 adult sexual assaults per 100,000 people in the NT is extremely high. And even lower bound estimates of alcohol involvement indicate that it is a notable factor. Evidence-based strategies going forward, if that is indeed what we aspire towards, will require us to acknowledge with some degree of humility and some calm that what has been done in the last 8 years in this space clearly does not have a strong evidentiary basis to support going forward in similar directions, no matter what our intuitive or anecdotal feeling might be. Labor has raised the point here, what will it take to address DV? Well, addressing alcohol policy in new ways. And that is precisely what this government is seeking to do in this first parliamentary sitting. I've said a lot in defence of qualitative data collection and the body of collective testimony presented here by members of this government in defence of the cohesive package that we are providing to reduce crime. I have said far, far less about the weight of analysis of this kind. The member for Johnson asked, what more do we need to be doing? What we need to be doing is also paying attention to academic research. I have a small understanding of what it takes to produce some content like this and the rigour that goes into this process. This work deserves to be read by everyone in this chamber. It deserves to be respected in a distinctive way alongside all of the collective testimony that is presented in this House. I therefore encourage all members of the House to be as well informed as possible if we are indeed of a collective mindset to address the prevention of matters of public importance that have been raised today. And that includes being mindful of research, the likes of which I have drawn attention towards.
Thank you, Member Fong Lim.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And the tone in here this evening is certainly sombre, and it's an important matter of public importance, and the information being debated tonight is sobering. But for the opposition to be genuine in an extension of bipartisanship, it must work with us and understand that we've got to do something different. Because unfortunately for the opposition, under 8 years of their watch, domestic violence increased 81%. And so whilst it's fine to stand here in this parliament and rattle off for the history books all of Labor's so-called achievements, what we know is that they didn't make an impact. And so whilst it's hard for Labor to take an ideologically different approach to the one and the path that they've been on for a very long time, what we've hit is a point where we must do something differently. We must try something differently. Or all we're doing is the same thing over and over again that didn't yield a result in the first place. And so if the extension of the true hand of bipartisanship is really there, we will see greater cooperation around laws protecting victims. We will see greater cooperation around making sure that the money is spent in a way that's going to deliver, that there are KPIs around outcomes, that we do hold service providers and governments accountable for that spend. Because the lives of predominantly women and Aboriginal women, are too important to just be driven by blind ideology in the hopes that one day, sometimes, something will be different. Now, domestic violence is, has complicated ways in which this comes about, the pathways in which someone is led to become a domestic violence offender. Part of it is because they've experienced it themselves. They've grown up in a household where that's been normal and that behaviour has been normalised, and as a child they've been exposed to horrific trauma and then go on to perpetrate that same trauma on other people, people close to them, people in a close relationship, people that they love or are supposed to love. Part of it is around economics. It's about making sure that we have a territory where everyone can participate in our economy, where people can have access to work, meaningful work, work that allows them to support their family. Part of it is around stronger laws, dealing with harms such as alcohol, and we've talked about alcohol a lot this evening. And even just on that point of alcohol, again, we had a now opposition, a Labor government for 8 years, focused very much on supply, which didn't yield results because the data doesn't bear it out. And we're taking a different approach to alcohol, like we just literally did, spent all day in Parliament passing stronger laws so that our police can intervene earlier, so that the what will be public drinking in the morning does not turn into domestic violence in the evening. And yet we were met with fierce opposition from every single member of the crossbench and opposition. So you either, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You either want to be having a new approach to this issue, or you want to sit there entrenched in your ideology and maintain the status quo. But my responsibility to the Territory is to remove the status quo. My responsibility as Chief Minister, as a government, is to do things differently. And that's what we're going to get on with the job of doing. So we appreciate very much this debate being brought into the Parliament, and it is very important. And it was week 2, I believe, Mr Deputy Speaker, of us coming into government, where I flew to Canberra and met with National Cabinet and put the case as hard as I possibly could to the Prime Minister about why per capita based funding for the Territory just makes no sense. But I didn't come back with needs-based funding, Mr Deputy Speaker, from a Labor Prime Minister and a Labor government. But we will continue that fight. We will continue to work with the federal government to make sure that the Territory is recognised for the situation that we are in. But money won't just solve this. It's how we spend it. It's the laws. It's the economic development. It's getting in early to these kids so that they don't have to grow up in a violent, traumatic childhood. And unless we're willing to tackle all of those issues together, you can't just pick the bits that feel good to you. So I welcome the debate, Mr Deputy Speaker. It is an incredibly important one. And the statistics for the Territory are damning. Absolutely damning. But we won't be afraid to try things differently. We won't be afraid to make sure we spend that finite resource we have as prudently and effectively as we possibly can. We won't be afraid to try and step in early into a young person's life to protect a victim or to intervene earlier in alcohol in an attempt to reduce those levels of harm. And I certainly look forward to the challenge ahead in dealing with all of these issues for every single Territorian, because we all know the problem is there. But what I also know is that if what you were doing was working, we would not be having this conversation in the first place.
Minister. Member for Barclay. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I rise to speak in regard to this matter of public importance. We know that domestic violence, domestic family and sexual violence is claiming the lives of too many Northern Territory women and tearing families apart. And yes, the Deputy Leader has raised that we should be working in a bipartisan way, but and I agree. But it's important that we look at how we got to this situation that we find ourselves in today, because it's important that we look back at not only some of the history, but some of the statistics that we're facing today, and some of the perhaps missed opportunities for the former Labor government to intervene, put in place policy and deal with the issues in a more holistic way, given that they were in government for 19 out of the last 23 years. So I thank the Leader of the Opposition for bringing this important topic to the House. Mr Deputy Speaker, domestic family and sexual violence, commonly referred to as DV as an acronym, is all too familiar in our jurisdiction. Just since August 24, there have been 3 DV-related deaths in public housing properties in your electorate, Mr Deputy Speaker, in Malacca alone. And these statistics in the Territory are clearly unfathomable. The number of victim survivors are growing every day. It's a scourge on the Territory, and domestic violence is certainly tearing families apart and destroying our communities. There's a couple of things that need to be put on the record, and back in 2022, Labor passed legislation to allow domestic violence offenders to be bailed in order to attend rehabilitation programs. Rather than bring in rehabilitation programs in prison, it was decided to bail people to go to rehabilitation programs. The court was given discretion to deem completion of a set program in exceptional circumstances, potentially meaning that the offender would avoid mandatory sentencing. Labor's approach included insufficient monitoring of offenders on bail whilst attending courses. In fact, overall domestic violence incidents have risen along with recidivist offending. And it's important that we do look at those statistics, and I know that the statistics have been spoken about, but it really is important that we put that on the record. And so across the Territory from 2016 to June 24, domestic violence-related assaults across the Territory rose 81.83%, nearly 82%. Alcohol-related assaults, 37.91%. But you know, when we look at other serious violent offending, acts intended to cause injury rose 62.24%. Sexual assaults across the Territory have risen 17.72%. Dangerous or negligent acts endangering persons have risen 45.52%. Even violent offences such as robbery, extortion and related offence have risen 343% in the Northern Territory just in the last 8 years. But importantly, I do want to go back to my electorate, Madam Speaker, because there has been quite significant offending in my electorate which has remained unabated for 8 years under Labor government. Just in Tennant Creek alone, Madam Speaker, domestic violence-related assaults have risen 101% in the last 8 years. Alcohol-related assaults, 57.62%. Again, if we go back to total offences against a person, 80% increase. Dangerous or negligent acts endangering people, 60% increase. Sexual assaults in Tennant Creek have risen 150% just in the last 8 years under this Labor government. So the statistics are extremely worrying when it comes to domestic, family and sexual violence. And it's not only those statistics, Madam Speaker, but I've spoken about this before in Parliament, but it's not only those offences, but it's the impact that it's having on children in those households as well. And I've referred to this before, but I just want to put this on the record that the Labor government published a story about children and young people in 2021, and this gave a snapshot of some of the things that I've been talking about, because when we hear about early intervention and prevention, it's clear to me that that hasn't been a focus under the Labor government. When I look at the story of our children and young people, the number and proportion of children aged 0 to 17 in the Berkeley with notifications of child abuse or neglect was 54.8% out of the 1,199 notifications of child abuse or neglect in 2021. But the number and proportion of children aged 0 to 17 in the Berkeley with notifications of domestic and family violence as a contributing factor was 29.6%, or 647 notifications of domestic and family violence as a contributing factor. So clearly that in itself has had a significant impact on young people in the Berkeley. But I'm always interested to hear about needs-based funding, but there's other things that can be done to try and reduce domestic, family and sexual violence. And I often talk about the Berkeley Regional Deal, and one of the key initiatives in there was the review of government investment and service system reform. We talk about service delivery and making sure that money goes to where it's needed most, and we all want to make sure that the services that are being funded are being delivered in an appropriate way. But in regard to that particular initiative under the Berkeley Regional Deal, there was supposed to be a review of government investment and service system reform when that was signed back in April 2019. And of course, like many things, the Labor government hasn't delivered that either. So when we look at the Royal Commission into Protection and Detention of Children in the Northern Territory, that found that child, youth and family services system across the Northern Territory to be disjointed and have gross efficiencies and waste, and to be less effective at achieving long-lasting benefits. The Productivity Commission report on expenditure on children in the Northern Territory found that the system of children and family services is highly fragmented, with overlaps, duplications and gaps in expenditure between and within government, and that services are poorly targeted and do not always account for the cultural strengths of the needs of children and families. Now, that goes right back to the Royal Commission into the Protection and Detention of Children, but if we go to March 2019, we look at the former Labor government's plan for budget repair. The government said, this is what the Labor government said at the time, that the report recommended that the Northern Territory government work with the Commonwealth and local governments to improve the coordination of services in remote communities, the Territory, to reduce areas of duplication. But again, that was never done by the Labor government either. So here we are, 5 years later. There's been no review of government investment and service system reform in the Berkeley. Labor ignored the own recommendation in their report for budget repair. I think that was the Langland report. But further on, in the Northern Territory Aboriginal Justice Agreement Action Plan, there's also a further commitment to review and redesign key service models and any contracted services that impact on justice outcomes to ensure they're efficient, effective and meet the needs of Aboriginal Territorians. Very little has been done in regard to that as well, even though the Aboriginal Justice Agreement was signed, I think, back in August 2021. So service system reform covers all of those areas around early intervention and prevention in reducing domestic, family and sexual violence. So it's important that we consider those missed opportunities by the Labor government. So also back in 2017, the Domestic Family and Sexual Violence Reduction Framework 2018 to 2028 was published. It was published in December 2017. Now, it's important to go back to that because the Labor government at the time listed 13 priorities for immediate action, which included developing a model to inform the investment in domestic, family and sexual violence resources, develop an integrated specialist domestic, family and sexual violence hub in Tennant Creek, which will support women and children in the Barkly region to be safe, recover and thrive, develop and implement a sexual violence prevention and response framework and gender equality strategy, support localised initiatives to promote respectful relationships and reform the service model for women experiencing domestic, family and sexual violence in remote communities. So the real question is, when we go back to 2018, how many of those priorities, as the government promised, the Labor government of the day promised, were immediately actioned? Well, one that was particular interest to me, and I can tell you categorically that not too many of those immediate priorities were implemented. You only have to look back at Tennant Creek. 6 months after that plan was released, the Labor government announced that it was providing $450,000 for an immediate project. That was $450,000 to develop an integrated and specialist domestic, family and sexual violence hub for Tennant Creek to support women and their children in the Barkly. But guess what? Like many promises made by that Labor government, that was never delivered. So there was no specialist integrated hub to deal with domestic, family and sexual violence in Tennant Creek. And as you've just heard, Madam Speaker, those statistics in Tennant Creek are extremely alarming. Domestic violence assaults up 101%, alcohol-related assaults up 57%, and that seems to have all been completely ignored by the Labor government. So when it comes to this matter of public importance, yes, I think there is room for a bipartisan approach, but what we need to do and what the Labor needs to do is accept that over the last 8 years in government, they have failed badly to put in place initiatives, failed to put in place a program of early intervention and prevention, and on top of that, they have failed, and as we've heard today, that connection between alcohol and domestic, family and sexual violence, what we've seen is the laws put in place by the government to tackle alcohol issues has all been focused around dealing with the supply of alcohol. And I often say, and I think the member for Gwaja did as well, prohibition will never work. So what we've seen is a whole focus on dealing with the supply of alcohol. We hear these issues about the floor price, but what we've seen by reducing the supply of alcohol is an increase in secondary supply. And when there's an increase in secondary supply, what it means is that people are buying alcohol for extremely exorbitant prices. And when people are doing that because of Labor's laws that they put in place, what it means is when someone pays $500 for a bottle of rum, rather than being able to go to the bottle shop and get half a dozen cans of beer because the bottle shop's closed, what it means is there's no food on the table for children in that household if someone pays $500 for a bottle of rum. And that is what the minimum unit price is showing, that there's been a shift from basic alcohol to heavier spirits, and that came out of the review of the minimum unit price, and that's what we're seeing at the moment when people are buying those heavier spirits, paying exorbitant prices for that. These are some of the things that it's actually contributing to crime, but making a massive contribution to conflict in the household, fighting in the household because there's no money to put food on the table. All of these laws, when combined, are contributing to an increase in domestic, family and sexual violence. What we need to do is take a step back, make sure that the services we've got are appropriately funded, the services are delivering, and then make sure we are focused on early intervention and prevention and working together to make a difference across the territory.
Member for Blaine.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise tonight to speak on this very important matter. I'd like to acknowledge the family of the member for Goyja who lost a loved one to domestic violence. Every life is precious. One life lost is too many. I'd also like to acknowledge the bipartisanship of this matter of public importance. From time to time we have a certain measure of opposition in this chamber, and it's really good that we've been able to come together and all speak on different aspects of the scourge of domestic violence that affects all of us in different ways. And I'm glad that we were able to all unite against this issue of domestic violence. So I thank the Leader of the Opposition for bringing it on. I'm a child of domestic violence. It's something that I saw growing up as a child. I'm not ready to talk about the full details in this house yet, maybe at a later date. There are many types of domestic violence. I want to call out 3 for special attention. One that we've been talking about quite a bit today is alcohol-fueled physical violence. So we all have seen and know couples who get along quite well together while they're sober, but then once the grog comes on, violence starts and people get injured. That, I think, is one of the things that the legislation we brought on today will hope to combat, and hopefully we'll be able to bring on more to combat this scourge as time goes on. Secondly, I'd like to distinguish non-alcohol fueled physical violence. This is more where it comes from something deep in the partner and it's not fueled by alcohol. It could be fueled by their insecurities, their who knows what character flaw it springs from. Taking action on alcohol won't help in this case. That's something that men's behaviour change programs and applying consequences for domestic violence will need to address. Tonight, I'd like to talk about something that doesn't get as much attention as the other types, and that's coercive control. And I've seen this, I'm sure many members of the chamber have seen this in people that we know, and it's very much as dangerous as the other types of domestic violence, but it's a lot less visible. In fact, it's very often invisible. And someone may be suffering from coercive control in silence, and you would never know until they open up and speak frankly with you about it. So I just want to get 12 signs of coercive control on the record. I'm taking this from relationshipsvictoria.org.au. So the first sign is isolating you from your support system. An abusive partner will cut you off from friends and family or limit your contact with them so you don't receive the support you need. Second sign is monitoring activity throughout the day. Third sign, denying freedom and autonomy. A person exerting coercive control may try to limit your freedom and independence, not allowing you to go to work or school, restricting access to transportation, stalking, taking your phone, etc. Gaslighting. This one is particularly insidious, and some of us may know situations where this is the case, where the abuser makes you doubt your own truth, experience and sanity by insisting that they are always right and instills their narrative of a situation even if the evidence points against this. Gaslighting is, in essence, based on lies and manipulation of the truth. That one is particularly insidious because it can lead the victim to believe that the abuse is their own fault. Name calling and severe criticism, as well as malicious put-downs, which are all extreme forms of bullying, was the 5th sign. The 6th sign, limiting access to money and controlling finances. This is a way of restricting freedom and ability to leave the relationship. Financial abuse is listed as a specific form of abuse, but within the context of coercive control, it's a tactic to keep a person disempowered. In the interest of time, I'll not read all the details. The 7th sign, coercing you to take care of all the domestic duties, such as cleaning, cooking, and childcare without sharing responsibility and tasks. 8th sign, turning the children against you. If you have children either with the abuser or someone else, they may try to weaponise the children against you by making comments that are critical of you, belittling you in front of the children, or telling them you're a bad parent. 9th sign, controlling aspects of your health and body. The abuser could monitor and control how much you eat, sleep, exercise, or how much time you spend in the bathroom. 10th sign, making jealous accusations about the time you spend with family or friends, either in person or online, as a way of phasing out all contact with the external world. 11th sign, regulating your sexual relationship. For example, making demands about the amount of times you engage in that activity each day or week. 12th sign, threatening children or parents as an extreme form of intimidation. I'm sure coercive control will return to this House in due course, but it's something particularly insidious that we need to be aware of. And if we encounter a family member or friend who is a victim of it, to be especially cautious. It's a biological fact that men, moving on, are stronger than women. And even though DV occurs in same-sex relationships, it's true to say that the largest amount of harm is male on female, and in the NT, the largest number of victims of domestic violence are Indigenous women. I'm a father of 3 boys, and I try my best to teach them that men's strength exists to protect and provide for their family, not to harm, never to harm. We need a multi-pronged approach to combat domestic violence. We need to take strong action first on alcohol-fuelled violence to address the circumstances of offending, providing men's behaviour change programs and holding men to account where domestic violence is proved.
Oh, God, sorry.
But we also need to teach young people what healthy relationships look like and what behaviour is not acceptable from a partner, so that young people are able to recognise dangerous patterns before it's too late. Then we need to support women who are trapped in these violent and coercive relationships to escape to safety. And escaping from a domestic violence relationship is a very sensitive and complicated matter, which I'm sure we'll return to in due course. Thank you, Leader of the Opposition, for bringing this important matter of public importance. And thank you, Madam Speaker.